Hello folks, Meteorologist Jamie Kagol here with your 12 News Weather School. The lesson for today, hurricanes. We're going to dive into the overall patterns we find in the hurricane season. We'll talk about their strength, where they develop from, why they move, the way they move, where they are most likely to strike, and we're going to be focused on the United States. And then we're also going to be talking about the Saffir-Simpson scale. That's the scale to determine the strength of these storm systems. So first things first, we're going to dive into why or where they develop. Now, when you look at this map here, we're focused on the lower portion of the North Atlantic. So we're getting north of the equator, but south of 40 degrees north latitude. And as we look to the west coast of Africa, that's where we focus when we talk about the peak of season, where we see those strong hurricanes develop. They start out innocent enough as just little pulses of energy that come off the west coast of Africa, little clusterings of thunderstorms, and they sit over these warm tropical waters, water temperatures well over 80 degrees, nice warm bath water. Well, as those storms sit over that warm water, they strengthen, they use that as fuel. There's also very light winds in this part of the Atlantic, so there aren't a lot of outside winds to really disturb these storm systems, so they have unfettered access to warm, moist air, and then nothing to really disturb them. So they continue to strengthen on their own. And over several days, if there is nothing to really impede their strengthening, they just continue to develop into that pinwheel pattern we're familiar with, the cyclonic flow, the counterclockwise rotation. And they start to take on that individual rotating storm system look. And with further and further strengthening, they develop from a tropical disturbance into a tropical depression into a tropical storm, and they can continue to build into a hurricane. That's what we refer to them as in the Atlantic. Other parts of the world will call them cyclones or typhoons. We call them hurricanes in the Atlantic basin. That's the area that we're referring to right now. That includes the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and the vast majority of the Atlantic Ocean. That's the Atlantic basin. That's the part that we are concerned about in the United States, because this is where the vast majority of our tropical systems will originate from. So again, we're talking about the strengthening of these storm systems coming across the Atlantic, and as we talk about the season now, our Atlantic hurricane season, that begins June 1st and ends November 30th, so 6 months. Now for the Eastern Pacific hurricane season, that will start 2 weeks earlier, May 15th, but they both end on the 30th. And when you take a look at the season here, you can see there is a distinct peak as we close out August and go into September. Typically the first week to 2 weeks of September is considered the peak of season, but you can see everything is ramping up through the month of August, peaks into September, starts to drop off as you move through September, and then you get this little secondary uptick in activity into October, and then things really start to close out in November. June and July, we do see some activity. It tends to be, though, popping up around the Gulf of Mexico and parts of the Caribbean. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. But when you get into the peak of season, August, September, into October, that's when you're really focused on the Atlantic. That's where we find the big storms, and you can have several storms out there at the same time, several named storms. 2, 3, 4, 5 named storms at once is certainly not an impossible scenario. So we'll start out with June, and this map shows you where they tend to pop up. Now, when we refer to June and into July, we see those storms popping up around the Gulf of Mexico and even around the very western Atlantic near the U.S. coastline. We call those homegrown storms. Those are the ones that pop up really close to home. You pop up a tropical depression, a tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico, maybe becoming a Category 1 hurricane. There's not a lot of time and space for those storms to really develop and strengthen. So they tend to be some of the weaker storms. It's also very early in the season. The Gulf of Mexico, the water temperature there, probably not hitting those low to mid 80s yet. You might have some upper 70s at that time. Low 80s is a possibility, especially as you get closer to Florida. Now, as we look to July, Now we start to include a little bit more of the Caribbean, but still in that homegrown scenario showing up on the map. But we're going to see the Caribbean starting to warm up as well. By this time, we should have water temperatures getting into those low 80s, even mid 80s. And then once we get to August, now we start to open up more of the Atlantic. And notice how that line extends back towards the islands just off the west coast of Africa, the Cape Verde Islands. That is typically kind of the starting line, if you will, for these hurricane developments. And we watch them continue to press west across the Atlantic, get into the Caribbean, get into the Gulf of Mexico. Most likely, again, right around the Leeward, Windward Islands as you get in towards places like Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and then extending towards the Bahamas. Notice, though, that everything pushes west-northwest direction and sometimes wraps up along the U.S. coastline. Now, as we go from August to September, now we're into peak season, and you can clearly see things are open for business, and that most likely that orange shaded area really covers a lot of the map. When we talk about September, the Gulf of Mexico is certainly under a lot of concern. Most of the northern Caribbean definitely concerning, and then as you get towards the Bahamas, and then again those Leeward, Windward Islands, as you get towards Hispaniola and into places like Puerto Rico, definitely very, very concerning, the peak of season. Remember, we saw a little uptick in October, so we still have that orange shaded area, but notice more of the Atlantic is now closing off. The temperatures are starting to drop, but we're still holding on to warm water around the Gulf of Mexico, the Western Caribbean, and that Gulf Stream. That's that current of water that rides along the east coast of the United States and pushes towards Europe. Notice how that orange area kind of follows that flow. So we're still keeping enough warm water there to keep the hurricane season going, and certainly still there is concern. And then watch this, as you go from October to November, you pretty much close things out. As you get close to Halloween, there's almost nothing developing out there. November is very, very quiet most of the time. June and July can get busy, but that's because they're homegrown storms. When you take all the storms from 1949, or excuse me, data in the Pacific is from 1949, and the data in the Atlantic goes back to 1851, you can see again how much impact that Atlantic basin has on the United States, as well as Central America. But the United States is just in a prime location for that. Notice, though, for the west coast of the United States, almost no activity there. Everything is too far south for that. Also, the water is cooler in the Pacific, so that really cuts down dramatically on the possibility of there being storm systems there. However, I will say this. For us here in Arizona, we don't necessarily take a direct hit, obviously, we're landlocked, but we can have the remnants of a storm system over the Baja, over the Gulf of California, over parts of the Pacific. It can fall apart, but still hold its moisture and some energy and move its way into the desert Southwest. So even though we don't have lines that necessarily cross over Arizona, we still get the impacts of it. And it is certainly worth noting when these storm systems develop there and what direction they may take. Now we'll get into some of the strength of these storms as well. But before we get there, I want to point out that right in the middle of the Atlantic, right there tends to be this big dome of high pressure. We call them quasi-stationary high pressure, meaning they pretty much just plant themselves there for the summer months. Well, this high, remember, with high pressure, the winds move clockwise around that high. So if you trace out the path of these hurricanes, they're moving clockwise around that high. They're moving, if the west coast of Africa, say that's like 6 o'clock, and it's moving to the west, getting to 9 o'clock as it approaches Florida, and then moving towards 12 o'clock on the clock as it gets out into the North Atlantic. That's why a lot of these storm systems are steered right into the Gulf of Mexico, right towards the east coast of the United States, into the Caribbean, is because there's a big dome of high pressure that steers those storms. They're very light winds, but they do enough to steer them, and that's why you see the pattern you see there. Now, into the strength of the storm systems, the Saffir-Simpson scale, when we talk about hurricanes, Category 1 through Category 5, there's the winds. And they measure those winds. They take those airplanes, the hurricane hunters, they fly those planes right through the hurricane. They measure the wind speeds as they approach the eye wall. And when you get that maximum sustained wind, they're looking for a burst of wind, a 1 minute measurement. They take that measurement, and where it falls into those categories determines the speed or the strength of that hurricane. So if it's 74 to 95, it's a category 1. If it's over 155 miles per hour, it's a category 5. The storm surge, that's approximate. Every storm's going to be a little bit different, and the coastlines are also different. But those are approximates, but you get the idea. The stronger the winds, the bigger the storm surge. The storm surge is the wave action coming ashore because of those strong winds. It's not one big wall of water, but it's just the constant repetition of waves coming ashore and those winds building up those waves, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Those winds generate a storm surge or wave action upwards of 18 or 20 feet with that category 5. And again, those are approximates right there. One thing you learn when you forecast and deal with hurricanes is you have to treat each hurricane as an individual storm. They're not the same. They don't just fall into a textbook category, and because it's category 4, you get these winds and this storm surge, and you're going to get this much destruction. These are all approximations. But the Saffir-Simpson scale with the winds, those are precise numbers. Category 1, 74 to 95. Category 2, 96 to 110, so on and so forth. But the surges, for the most part, typically approximates. So where do these wind measurements come from? Around the eye wall. So when you find the eye of that hurricane, that's that little pocket right in the middle that opens up. And typically right in the middle there, it's fairly quiet, fairly calm. Blue skies, a little bit of a cloud cover in there, but it's very peaceful compared to the rest of the storm in the eye. The cloud surrounding that eye is the eye wall. That is where you find the strongest winds of the hurricane. So it almost seems ironic that in the middle, it can be very, very quiet, very peaceful, and just outside the eye is the eye wall, is the most violent of the winds. Now, when we say we have winds of 110 miles an hour with a hurricane, we're measuring those strongest winds around the eye wall. That doesn't mean that the rest of the hurricane has winds of 110 miles an hour. The winds diminish or weaken as you move away from the eye wall. So on the outskirts or the very outer edges of the hurricane, you might have winds of 30 or 40 miles an hour, while in the eye you have winds of 150 miles an hour. Certainly a possibility there that as you move further and further out, again, that these winds just continue to die off. So if you don't take a direct hit and it just kind of clips you, you certainly may not have that much to worry about. But a direct hit by those winds, and it will be a long duration that you're hit by those winds, that is where the devastation comes from. Also from the storm surge, from that water, from the flooding. Also very, very devastating. So that's a look at hurricanes. I hope you enjoyed the lesson here. I hope it have a better understanding and appreciation for some of the fury that Mother Nature can unleash, and also an understanding of where they come from, how they develop, and when to expect them. Thank you for joining me for 12 News Weather School, and we'll see you again.